Hello everyone, this is Red. So, I felt the need to do a small post here because it's been a little while. And I figured I should share a project I'm working on. This thing is called the Tripteron. This is a 3D printer that works similar to how a delta does and a cartesian printer, being that a delta works on 3 axes that move around a nozzle. This piece right here is the nozzle that would move around using these pivot points here. The filament I've used has been PLA for the most part, handling these parts and these parts at the very end. Though my goal is to be mostly PETG because that has been my filament of choice. That has worked the best for me and is also just better for this style of a print. I don't have a lot of it. I have a lot of ABS and PLA. So this printer I found on Thingiverse. I'll post a link to the thing on Thingiverse down below in the description, and I will also post the files for the screws I made and these beams. Everything else is in the Thingiverse file, but otherwise, these screws I 3D designed. I found a file for these beams. Not these beams specifically, these are just some beams that I found just out of random, but the beams I'm going to be using and will recommend to use will be a Tinkercad file. The reason being is because these beams don't have any engravings or any holes in them, which works perfectly for these ones because they mean they're super sturdy. But if I needed to put a screw in them or anything like that, or run wheels along them, I wouldn't be able to do that. But with another set of beams, I'm able to do that. So the goal with this printer is originally the Tripteron that I found was supposed to be a partly printed 3D printer. Meaning that, like, this is printed, these hinges are printed, but you would buy ball bearings, screws, and beams separately. But what I did instead was I designed some screws, tracked down some beams. These are 2020 extrusions, by the way, so if anyone wants to build this and just not bother with printing, that's doable. And I even 3D printed some beams, or bearings that are pretty quiet. That's 3D printed. If you're wondering what's in the background, that is my Ender 3 making the first of the frame. Because right here I have all the moving parts, so now I just need the carriage to move these things around, and I need the actual frame part itself. So the original sizing for this printer's frame was 305mm beams. I shrunk it down, well, my goal was to shrink it down to 250, but instead when I was doing my calculations for these smaller beams at first, I used 200 beams as my benchmark. So this printer's accidentally going to be tiny. Though thankfully, because of this thing's movement method, that's okay, because the print space is going to be almost completely available, which is pretty nice. Yeah, that's really my only update on this is a almost completely 3D printed 3D printer. The only things that I'm not going to print out for this are going to be the board and the electronics, because those can't be 3D printed, at least not with an Ender 3. There are 3D printers and PCB makers that could do this for me, but I don't feel like doing that. But yeah, I have all of this set up. I'll do another video on this at some point when I feel that it's pressing. Maybe I've gotten a lot more of the frame done. Maybe I'll do a video of just the assembly of this, but it's a super cool printer. It looks really spider-like when it's moving, you know, because it would move around like this. Yeah. There's a video on the Thingiverse link that will show its movement methods. Yeah. But that's basically it for this, at least for today. I don't know if you've noticed, but some of the horrifying, unsatisfying rafts here, my camera's not picking them up properly, but that's because, I don't know, print was probably too close to the raft and just didn't want to come off. But yeah, PETG is my choice for making this thing, but unfortunately PETG is, well, I just don't have a lot of it, so hopefully I can get this print going with PETG for the most part. If anyone wants to make this printer, that's why I have all the files and links down below, so you can make this printer for yourself. I'll even put down the instructions that I built this with, and some of the descriptions of the parts and screws that I designed for this thing. And even some of the privileges of this thing being almost entirely printed. In fact, I'll show one right here. So, with the original design, you'd have a screw here, here, bottom, and side on all of these. That's a lot of screws and a lot of printing for me. So I thought if I could skip them. And so when I printed it out, I just slotted this in there. And for being a printed part, this is in there firmly. Without any screws or anything like that, this is in there and not coming out on its own. Or even with force. Well, I just got it out a little bit, but that took force. This thing's not going to come across that amount of force. So, yeah, that's one of the privileges of this thing being entirely printed. Another privilege is this thing, when completed, is going to be about 80 bucks. When I get to the electronics part, I'll even post the motors that I use, but I have yet to decide on specific motors. The board I'm going to be using for this thing is an SKR 1.4. Check that out if you want. You can use an SKR 1.3. That doesn't matter, so long as you have something that has one extruder and everything else like that. But yeah, essentially the Tripteron is just a 3D printed 3D printer that is a Cartesian style on a delta axis.